Coming up on This Week in Radio Tech, we're talking with Ernesto Aguilar. He's the program director at the National Federation of Community Broadcasters. Why is it important to us as engineers? Well, it's fun. It's important for the community, and you may want to get involved. Check it out. It's coming up next on TWiRT. This Week in Radio Tech is brought to you by Broadcasters General Store with outstanding service, savings, and support. Online at bgs.cc. By Angry Audio. Audio problems disappear when you get angry at angryaudio.com. And by Max Connect Wireless, prioritized high-speed internet service designed for transmitter sites and remote broadcasts. Welcome into This Week in Radio Tech, the show where we talk about everything from the microphone to the light bulb at the top of the tower. I'm Kirk Harnack, your host, and well, here, look at all this TWiRT behind me. And Telos Alliance. I'm in the Telos Alliance studio in Nashville, Tennessee, where I live, and delighted to be here. Thanks a lot, Telos, for supplying some of the gear right here behind me in the studio, and plenty of gear over behind you in the studio, and also for giving me a little time every Thursday to do the show. This is the show where we talk about radio technology, and it's not always deep tech. Sometimes we do deep tech, and sometimes we do, let's say, light tech. We talk about the business of radio and the culture of radio. Today we're going to try to bring you some culture. Ooh, it's a little scary. So that's my story. Let's see our co-host, Chris Tobin, is here. Chris, hi, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Kirk. I'm looking forward to a conversation, public community radio, which could be good, and it's just a great time. I'm having my coffee and just kicking back and getting ready for some. I'm drinking. We were talking about drinking earlier. I'm drinking coffee.
You're drinking.
Just make sure everyone understands. It's French roast, Paul Newman's. It's good stuff. That's what I'm doing. I'm drinking coffee. I know Andrew's now spitting at the in the chair with Bob and the others at the bar, going, "What the devil is he doing? That's not what we're drinking." I said, "It's coffee." I didn't say what else is there. It's just coffee.
Even worse, at least as far as Andrew's concerned, I'm drinking tea. Let's see if you can. Yeah, you can see that. It's black and orange pico tea. So I'm a lightweight, and I've got some lemon water to keep the thirst quenched. I don't know. It's dry here. It's cold outside here in Nashville. Snow was falling earlier today, and the heating system has been on. We're sucking down natural gas, keeping the house warm, and that makes the air dry. And so, got to have some wet.
Well, everyone's probably listening on what the devil's the point of the coffee and tea conversation. The point is, as engineers, technicians, and people who work hours other than 9 to 5 and are expected to maintain mission-critical operations, you need to have something to enjoy while you're working on the crisis or maybe in between crises. And a cup of coffee sometimes is a nice way to bridge the gap. For some, it's tea. That's just what we're talking about. And if you don't understand this and realize it, look back at the last 400 episodes, you'll know about why we do this.
There have been some episodes where there were some adult beverages consumed. Yeah.
This is true. On location, can do that.
While wearing Hawaiian shirts, if I recall some of our earlier, with Chris Tarr. Remember him? Hawaiian shirt? I think we all had him on. I think we were all yeah. All right.
Well, hello, my name is Jeff Welton. That's another episode.
That's another episode. All right. Hey, enough about us. We've got a guest, and we kind of got a different feel for today's show. We are going to talk some tech and the need for tech, but we're also going to talk about a part of radio broadcasting that I feel doesn't get enough talk, doesn't get enough recognition. It's there. It's really important to some people. And in some communities, it's all they have. And we're going to talk about some of that too. I want to welcome to our show, Ernesto Aguilar. Ernesto, welcome in. Glad you're here. How you doing?
Thank you so much for having me on the program. Actually, the conversation about tea and drinks reminds me, for those of you who've seen the film that Cheech and Chong did, for those of you of a particular age or have seen this on Netflix, where one of them sips out of a glass in front of a judge's desk and then realizes, hey, there's vodka in this. So I'm not going to question you guys, but okay, I see you.
He's absolutely right. I didn't say what kind of coffee. I mean, there's different types. There's Italian, Irish. I'm a consenting adult. Why not? What's the problem with this?
Hey, I asked Ernesto to be on the show, and he graciously agreed. He wasn't scared that we'd scare him off or embarrass him or anything like that. And of course, we wouldn't do that. Ernesto, you had an article, it seems like, that came out, and I'm sorry, now I'm having a senior moment, not remembering what the article was about. Why did I contact you? What was that about that you had written?
I do a weekly column for Radio World magazine. For those of you who are in engineering, chances are you've seen Radio World at some point or another. They cover engineering, tech, and the radio business as a whole. And one of the things I've reflected on is the impact that changes in engineering are having on community radio stations. I work for an organization that represents community radio stations, about 65% of which are rural in our organization. We've been around for 40 years, and many of them are having a little bit of a crisis around this area, and I reflected a bit on that. And also a shout out to some of the great engineers to support some of these stations and be involved in them in any capacity they possibly could.
So we're going to talk about community broadcasters, and your position. You're the program director at the National Federation of Community Broadcasters. Well, what is that organization about that you might not assume from the name?
So the organization NFCB was founded around 1978, and
Oh, wow.
those of you who have been around a particular amount of time may remember that radio around that time was definitely a bit different than what it is today. NFCB was founded out of this convergence of people who thought that radio stations should serve community interests, and so they gathered together in Madison, Wisconsin, at this event called the National Alternative Radio Convention, also known as NARC, but the NARC was a K, and it was 1978, and everyone decided that this was an opportunity for everybody to get together and support different stations that wanted to bring in different elements of their communities onto the broadcast airwaves, whether those were religious groups or different interest groups or different kinds of music that weren't otherwise represented on the commercial spectrum. These were folks who said, we'd like to have community folks involved in our regions. And so that organization came together and provided both programming as well as logistical support to many of those stations. We were also some of the earliest advocates in DC for community radio stations and non-commercial radio as a whole. Tom Thomas and Terry Clifford, who are well-known folks in the non-commercial radio sphere, drove out to Washington, D.C. from Wisconsin, lived out of their van for a while, and did lobbying work with the FCC and did lobbying work with Congress to explain the importance of these organizations and why they're so relevant. And from there, NFCB was born. We have done all kinds of leadership training for stations. We've helped stations with different kinds of operational or programming or revenue or development support within the non-commercial radio sphere. And that's what we have been doing since 1978. For those of you who are in radio, you're familiar with this likely, but I'll break it down just in case you're not. The FCC has different designations for radio stations. There are commercially designated stations and other stations which are designated as non-commercial educational. Those tend to be both the religious broadcasters as well as the community and public radio broadcasters. And we end up serving quite a bit of the community radio space. There are also full power stations in that space and low power stations in that space. 9 times out of 10, 9.5 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10, those are 501c3 nonprofit organizations who run those stations.
Yeah. And is it true that quite a few of what are still community broadcasters indeed were formed in the late 70s and early and mid 80s? It seems I've heard of a few that started then.
So there are quite a few stations that were founded quite a few years ago. I can think of KBOO out in Portland, KBOO out in Portland, that was founded about 50 years ago. KPOO out in San Francisco, which has been around for just about the same amount of time. KTFA out in Berkeley, California, WBAI in New York, and a number of other stations were founded many years ago and are still on. WORT in Madison, Wisconsin, just celebrated just over years. KGNU out in Boulder, Colorado has been around for a number of years. There are also a number of newer stations too, particularly in the low power space. Low power FM, as I'm sure you covered on the show, has been around for about a decade. And so many of those stations have been on the air for about 10 years, and in some cases even less. There was a station I just talked to recently, KSQD out in the Bay Area, that just celebrated its 1-year anniversary.
Gotcha. Hey, if I could ask Chris Tobin, what's been your exposure to community broadcasters? What was your first exposure, and are you involved in any community stations now, Chris?
Well, I mean, I work for a public station that does a lot of community involvement. We do a lot of stuff with the community on various levels. My early days, about back in 1978, 79, I was doing work with part-time, just not even work. It was just volunteer work with a couple of public stations in the New York Metro. WBAI in the early days had a lot of folks coming through the door to help move things along for the community activities they were involved in. But yeah, around here there's a lot of college stations. I've done a lot of work with college stations. I've been part of community broadcasting in various various levels, if you will, and it continues. I mean, some of the best programming, or how would you say, discovery? Okay, content discovery you can get on community stations, and college stations are part of communities within the campus of the college, as well as where the college is located. Their campus could be the community, the county, the district they're in. If you're on Long Island, there's several colleges that have large communities within the small town and the hamlets that they're in. And the same is true as upstate New York. If you travel through the Catskills, you'll come through a lot of community stations doing stuff. Well,
that brings me to a question for Ernesto. What is the difference between what you typically call a community station and a public radio station, maybe run by under the auspices of a university or a library system, or maybe it's independent, versus other types of broadcasters that are also non-commercial? What typifies one of your members?
Community station to be programmed by the community, local community, whether that's a volunteer base or students in some cases. There are a lot of college radio stations that do a hybrid, so to speak. They'll have mostly students on the airwaves, but they may also have community members that participate on the dial. A lot of the stations also tend to have quite a big mix of programming. You may tune into a lot of college stations and community stations that may have music on 1 hour and may have a talk show on later, or may have classical music and then heavy metal later, or folk music or jazz or something else in between. A lot of community stations, for some of the areas that they're in, are oftentimes the only conduit for particular genres of music. So those stations end up being this steward, so to speak, of local music and culture. And they have people from the community who aren't necessarily professional DJs, for better or worse. In many cases for better, but sometimes it's a little quirky. And that is part of the mandate of what community radio off does for a city or a town.
Gotcha. I was just thinking, probably my first exposure to what seemed to me at the time like a community broadcaster was, and I'll date myself a little here, was on the TV show Northern Exposure. Remember KBHR, the radio station on Northern Exposure? I don't know if they ever ran any ads. It felt like a community station because, whoever was on the air at the time, it was their show. Ernesto, do you know if KBHR was a community station fictitiously?
I think that that's definitely, and I remember that show. That really is about what a community radio station would be. A lot of folks will come in off the street and decide they're going to share a program, or they will just pass it on. And it may be a similar kind of program. It may be something completely different. And that's really, I think, for community stations, that's what the intention of what it should be, what a community's voice could possibly be, and gets a chance to always see the wrinkles of it, the beauty of it, and ideally get a new appreciation for our neighbors and friends.
Gotcha. So I had another exposure to not a northern exposure, but another exposure to community radio, and that was when I really got busy with my engineering business. I lived in Memphis, Tennessee, and there's a community station there still going. In fact, I just talked with the program director of that station yesterday in a phone conversation. We reconnected, a fellow named Brian Craig, and that's at WEVL, as in weevil, like boll weevil, like the bug that eats cotton plants. But WEVL in Memphis seems like a very active and typical community station. They have all different kinds of programming. When I was doing engineering there, a fellow who worked for me, an engineer, was volunteering his time to engineer for them, and so I volunteered a bit of time as well. So, are you familiar with that station, Ernesto?
I love Brian Craig, who is a great program director. Judy Dorsey has been managing that station for
Oh yeah,
a
Judy.
number of years. And yeah, they're a fantastic group of folks. And I think they, to me, are really about what the heart of community radio is. They're really committed to local music. They're committed to local culture and ensuring that the voice of that community is protected and preserved and has a space on the dial. I mean, there are so many stations around the country that just don't have the bandwidth to provide that local connection as much as possible. I think they would like to, but just can't. And so these community stations really fill a void for these communities. And I think WEVL's a perfect example of that.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm glad that's a real. It felt like the right kind of example, and I'm sure they have they have a website, WEVL.org, I believe it is. So, hey, we're talking with Ernesto Aguilar. He's our guest today. He's the program director at the National Federation of Community Broadcasters. I'm Kirk Harnack, along with Chris Tobin here. We're going to talk about the programming that makes a community station what it is, what some of their different equipment needs might be different than typical commercial broadcasters these days. So, hey, engineers, if you're called upon to do some work at a community station, if you want to volunteer some time, then you might be better prepared if you know what to expect. Right now, I'd like you to expect a better connection no matter where you are outside. Okay, you got to be in range of a cell tower. I get that. But I want to tell you about Max Connect. This thing is amazing. This is a cradle point modem. And yeah, that's kind of ordinary, a cradle point modem. But this one is special. Why? Because inside it are two different SIM cards, but they're not ordinary SIM cards. There's one in here for AT&T and one for Verizon. But those are just the master networks to which they connect. You're really connecting through a service called Max Connect Wireless. I know it's spelled funny, so we'll put it in the show notes, maxconnectwireless.com. And what's different about it? The difference is you get priority over all those other bums who are using their cell phones right now. So you can be at a big outdoor event. You could be at Lollapalooza. You could be at Bonnaroo, just down the road from me here in Tennessee. You could be at halftime at a big football game, and your live broadcast is going on from the stands, from the press box, from outside at the tailgating party. And even though everybody else is using their cell phone, you get priority. And that means that your audio, your real-time, on-the-air broadcast remote audio gets on the air. This also works for video. This one is set up for 5 megabits per second up and down, and we've done TWiRT shows using Max Connect Wireless. I got a feeling we're going to be using one in Las Vegas here in just a month and a half or 2 months from now. So check it out, Max Connect Wireless. Yep, spelled funny. I'll put it in the show notes. Oh, there you see it right there, maxconnectwireless.com. Please check them out. It really works, and you're going to love it. Also, T-Mobile's been added. So if you happen to like T-Mobile, whether it's Verizon, AT&T, or T-Mobile, Josh Bone at Bone Broadcast in Alabama, it was his brainstorm to do this. He's done the heavy lifting of working with these carriers to get this service available for you. So check it out, Max Connect Wireless. All right, hey, This Week in Radio Tech is also brought to you by my friends over at Angry Audio. And I was just talking with, or reading some work from our friend Richard Parker up in Alaska with Coast Alaska. And he's rebuilding some studios, and he's doing some putting in some some Axia digital consoles. Of course, he's using plenty of this kind of wiring from well, you're familiar with it as being Studio Hub wiring. Now, all the Studio Hub cabling items are available from Angry Audio. There's other items from Angry Audio too, and I got to show you this if you haven't seen already. You're probably familiar with the headphone amps from Studio Hub. This is one of them. Small little headphone amp. Powerful, though. Yeah, this will knock your ears off. And it's powered with the Studio Hub standard connector right there, and it'll pass power from one to the next. So that's cool. But you know what? The smart folks over there at Angry Audio have a couple other headphone amps available. This one is for placement underneath the console. And look how curved it is, so you don't catch your pants or your stockings, your hose, whatever you got, or your skin if you're wearing short pants. You don't catch yourself on this. It's nice. It hangs right under there, screws in from the bottom. And on the back, you can power it with Studio Hub, or you can power it with a wall wart, and then you can carry that power on to the next Studio Hub device. So wire several of these in series. Everybody gets their own volume control. And look, it's got both sizes, 1/4 inch, and it's got 1/8 of an inch connectors on there as well. Then if you really want to get fancy, check this out from Angry Audio. This is called the guest gizmo. It does a couple of things. It lets the guest hit a cough button, or if you got the logic hooked up just right, it can be on and off. And if you hold it, it can be cough. It also has a headphone amp and headphone jack built into it. And check this out. You drill a 2 3/4 inch hole in the top of your console. You lay this in, and it looks like you've got a nice squared off design here. It's absolutely beautiful when this lays into the console, and it's just awesome. Check it all out at angryaudio.com. That's the website, angryaudio.com. And when you go there, or when you talk to your dealer about getting some adapter cables, be sure you mention This Week in Radio Tech and get your free Cat 5 cables with every one of these adapter cables you buy that's got the female RJ on it. You get a free Cat 5 cable. But you got to mention This Week in Radio Tech and insist on getting it. They don't give them away easily. No, you got to say, hey, give me my free cables. You order 20 adapters, you get 20 free Cat 5 cables. So check them all out. All right. You're watching or listening to This Week in Radio Tech. It's our 481st episode. I'm Kirk Harnack here, along with Ernesto Aguilar, and Chris Tobin is with us as well. So we're talking to Ernesto about community broadcasters. And Ernesto, let's kind of jump into the engineering needs of a community broadcaster. They have needs too, and they may have quite an eclectic looking studio. Why don't you paint a picture for us, if you would, Ernesto? Tell us about some of the variety of equipment that you see in community broadcasters. I'll bet there's turntables in a lot of them because people bring their own records in, right?
And cassette players. They can't forget the cassette players.
Cassette players. Oh, gee.
Well, because cassettes are having quite a bit of a resurgence right now. We've all heard about vinyl, but especially, and surprisingly, I'm hearing a lot of this on college campuses because college students are fascinated by cassettes. In some cases, they were not alive when cassettes were in their heyday, and so they're a bit of a novelty these days.
Yeah.
When you think about it.
Hadn't thought about that. That's true.
It's really true. But yeah, cassettes are a big thing right now for a lot of independent labels and for a lot of student-run stations. The fact you mentioned Coast Alaska reminded me of just the ways they've had to do some of their tech. And we've had some of our team go out to Coast Alaska stations, and some of they're very typical of a lot of the community stations. Some of them are in older buildings, sometimes old houses. The station I used to work at, KPF in Houston, was actually built in an old house that was owned by the James Baker family. And it was used in the 1930s and 40s for dinner parties. And it was willed to the station by who ended up buying it in the 50s and used it as an art gallery. And so the whole building was pretty much retrofitted to be radio studios. And that's not unusual for a lot of community radio stations, which have decided that they're going to use an old bathroom or a dining room or sunroom and make it into a radio studio. And as you can gather from that, there's a little bit of tinkering that's had to be done with particular rooms and particular pieces of equipment and furniture in order to make everything fit. A lot of the equipment at community stations tends to be pretty manual, so a lot of the cooler new digital stuff they don't use as much. Primarily it's a cost issue. However, there is certainly a need for engineers to help them get a better handle on how to do these things. Many of the folks who got involved because they want to serve the community. They want to provide music or arts or culture or ideas or news or something like that. Engineers can be a little bit harder for some of these stations to attain on a professional basis. A lot of them do, of course, have engineers that work for them, but on a regular basis, having people drop in a few turntable decks or a few cassette decks or a CD player or two tends to be a little bit of a challenge sometimes. So they manage to make it work and manage to bring out a lot of magic from communities, but there is a little bit of labor involved, the labor of love, so to speak.
Understood. Hey, Chris, why don't you, I didn't ask you to think about this, but you can come up with stuff on the fly. Chris, if you were designing a studio with cast-off gear, secondhand gear, maybe you had to buy a couple things, if you've got to design a studio where you have a couple of turntables and CD players and cassette players and something to stick, a USB drive into to play some files, maybe even a reel-to-reel machine. Chris, what are you thinking might be important in designing a studio like that to serve a community broadcaster?
Well, the first approach I would take, and I know funding is always tough, but first thing is the size of the room, or the control room, studio, whatever you're going to call it, and then the layout. The one thing that I've come across many, many times over the years has been working with facilities, and a few of the stations I've worked for in my career, yes, they were in homes, they were in houses that were handed down from the original owners from the 40s and 30s, and then just kept that way. The one thing I did discover is that people overlook the obvious, which is the space, the layout, the counter space. Say it's like you're renovating your kitchen. What's the first thing you want to find? Extra counter space. Why? Because you want to lay out the ingredients for what you're cooking. So if you think of the stove as our mixing console, where's the counter space for all the ingredients for the mixing console? How many times is a studio built and all of a sudden you realize, oh, the computer keyboard's on top of the remote panel for the turntables. Oh, yeah, that's right. So my suggestion, my approach, if I was doing something, I have done this on many occasions, I'd start at the mixing console position, try and get as many faders as I can possible. Do not get caught up in the, how would you say it, the shiny object approach of, I could do 5 faders and 6 pages of input control, and we can have 27 inputs in the room with only 5 faders.
Oh, that could be complicated, for users.
But here's why you don't do it. Not because I don't like the technology, not because I think it's, remember who the end user is. Walk a mile in the shoes of your community person. As Ernesto pointed out, sometimes they're not professionals. That's okay. The point is they're telling a story, they're part of the community, and they're trying to convey a story. So people will listen. But they don't have any idea how a mixing console works, nor should they. Do they know how a CD player starts, or a turntable starts, or a reel-to-reel, open reel that is? Sure. But from the consumer side. So build a layout, keep it roomy. Don't, skimp on the space. Make it comfortable. Because remember the other thing. The human brain can process many things at once in the conscious mind. The subconscious mind does like millions of operations. If you're in a room that's cluttered and you can't focus, you suddenly start to become panicky. And slowly your blood pressure rises. And before you know it, your focus disappears. And before you know it, your show now suffers. Now, rather than the show being poorly produced because the person didn't know what they were doing, they were being influenced by their environment, not by what they had. So my approach has always been, even professional studios, and we had Lee Harris on from a very large populous station here in New York City who mentioned that when we built the studios for the announcers, we did keep in mind the layout and how they could reach everything with a simple look down at the board, muscle memory, and they can make things happen. Community stations need to consider that too. If you're engineering, sit down with somebody who's going to do a regular show from there and say, okay, how do you see yourself working the turntable? Is the turntable going to be remote started? Well, no. Well, then the turntable is going to have to be within arm's reach. Or at least if you lean over, as I'm leaning over in the video, it can't be too far. Because remember, you don't know who's going to be using it. So that's the approach to take. It's a tough one because we tend to look at things from a boilerplate approach. It's like, hey, what microphone are you going to buy for your studio? Oh, it's a standard. Such and such, such and such. Why? Because everybody uses it. Yeah, but you're going to be doing music. That's the worst microphone for music. It is? Boom. You just, that's what you got to watch out for. So I would say start with the mixing console. Try your best to get a large fader, one fader for each item so you can label it. They turn it on and off as they need it. They don't have to worry about it. They fade up. It's positioned. Now I can focus on my CDs, my vinyl, my cassettes. And that's what you want because that's what's the show. That's what's going to make it work. You want to be successful. You want to be able to raise funds. You want to be able to say to the community you're working with, hey, we're not professionals, but we sound professional. Here's why. So when they come in and see what they're paying for or buying into or donating to, they go, wow, you guys really got this operation going. I'll give you $10, $100, or a grant.
Chris,
I'm not belittling the dollars. I'm just saying it's what's in it for me. Think about it. I mean, if you're a community station, you've got to really think about 2 things: the community you're trying to serve and the community who's coming in to serve the community. If you don't pay attention to that, you could have the best programming in the world. You could have the best engineer. You could be the best studio location on top of a building overlooking the city. No one's going to participate. I'm being frank and honest because I have friends who do this for a living, consultants, and the stories they tell me of how they fight managers of other facilities are like, no, you don't want to. We want to do it this way. It's like, yeah, you know what's going to happen. The sun's going to rise. It's going to come through that window, and it's going to be blaring right in your announcer's face. No, it'll be fine. A couple of months later, after construction's done, the studios are on the air. Guess what the phone call is? How do we put shades up in the studio? I know it sounds obvious, but it does happen.
So I've got Chris. I want to come back to you in a few minutes. Be thinking about advice for a layperson to make a space that wasn't intended to be a studio, to make it a bit more sound friendly. So be thinking about, what are some things you can do to the walls, to the floor, to the ceiling if you need to make it more sound friendly. Because I've seen community stations, located in a house or in a retail space or in an office space that was never designed to be a studio. And so be thinking about that. Meanwhile, Ernesto, in the pre-show a couple of days ago, we talked about a community in Texas. I believe it was Marshall, Texas, and how they had some engineering challenges there. And then that led to our discussion about a training program that PRSS has. Why don't you tell us about both Marshall, Texas, and this engineering training program?
Yeah, certainly so. One of the biggest struggles for, I think, all stations currently, but certainly in the non-commercial and the community radio space as a whole, is a shrinking pool of engineers. There are folks who are retiring or deciding to change careers, and so as a result, they're maybe not engineering the way that they may have been 10, 20 years ago. However, for a lot of stations, they haven't managed to recruit engineers to either come into their communities, or they haven't really fostered relationships with engineers in the area. The example I gave to you just a few days ago was an example of Marfa, Texas. Those of you who've probably heard something about Texas, you probably hear about cities like Austin or Dallas, but chances are you might have heard of Marfa as well. It's a small town of about 2,000 people between El Paso and Odessa, and it has gotten a lot of publicity because there's a big arts community there, Marfa, Texas, and you will hear a lot about it because it has that large patronage of artists and musicians who will drive out to the middle of nowhere in Texas, so to speak. And I'm born and raised in Texas, so I can say this, but it's like a very remote area of Texas, and want to play music, want to do art, want to set up a restaurant, whatever it will be. And people will flock from all over the country to this city. And I noted to Kirk that this station is very typical of a lot of stations in community radio, except for this one being very special and being in a very well-known city, has had challenges attracting engineers. And I remarked that if a city like this, which is world-renowned for its artistry, for its food, for its culture, and for its music scene, can attract somebody hip and interested in those kinds of things to come out there, a city that is in rural Minnesota, in Idaho, in a small town in Iowa that might be serving a small community there as a station, is going to have probably a more difficult time attracting somebody. And so the public radio satellite system has set up an institute, so to speak, or an academy, if you will, to help train up the next generation of engineers. So those who may have maybe a little bit of skill in engineering or a little bit of interest in engineering can apply for scholarships and get some training. They'll have to have some skin in the game, so they have to contribute some money to get that training, but PRSS will help enable individuals who are interested, to get training, and also to go to things like the National Association of Broadcasters conference to get a little bit of peer interaction and networking, and give people a chance to become the engineers that they may have aspired to be, or maybe they're working with a community station or in a very small community, a tribal station, whatever that may be, and get a chance to become a full-fledged engineer and really apply that love to that area of radio that they may have been attracted to, but give them a chance to do it, on a professional or quasi-professional basis, even if they might have started out a volunteer.
And thank you for the correction about the town in Texas. I've heard of Marfa, Texas, and I know that's an artsy, crafty place. In fact, that town appears in a short story that I narrated, actually on Audible.com. So I should have put two and two together right there right away. But tell me, for some years, we as engineers have heard about LPFM licenses, and so I was wondering how many LPFMs are also community broadcasters versus religious outlets or other things. How many qualify as community broadcasters?
So you're probably looking in the neighborhood of anywhere from 1,500 to 2,500 stations of the pool of stations, and I think the estimate's around 4,000 for low power FM. About half of those are religious broadcasters. About probably a little less than half of those are community broadcasters, but they all equally have a lot of the same challenges. They're not as challenged, so to speak, as a large full power broadcaster, but they still have a transmitter, they still have equipment, they've still got an antenna they've got to get put up on a building, they still have maintenance they have to take care of and such. They don't have the same requirements technically in terms of filings for the FCC. The bar is much, much lower than a full power station, but they're always looking for engineers and always have their own issues and needs in those areas.
I've got some questions about license renewal and FCC paperwork and things like that, but we're gonna hold that question and answer till after this break. I want to remind folks that our show is brought to you in part by our friends at Broadcasters General Store. You talk about friendly to both commercial broadcasters, public broadcasting, and community broadcasters. Broadcasters General Store, there's people there. They're real people. There's a couple of families that run and own the business, and they really care about the broadcaster, you and your equipment needs. I mean that. I've been dealing with them for a long, long time now. Probably 35 plus years, maybe more. And one of the lines that they carry is from Innovonics. Innovonics, man, the first audio processor I ever bought was from Innovonics. It was affordable. It was for an AM station that I was managing at the time and engineering at. And so let's see what we have from Innovonics right now. In just a minute, we'll be right back.
The Aaron 655 is the latest addition to the Innovonics family of rebroadcast receivers, designed specifically for FM broadcast translators, also referred to as relay transmitters. The Aaron 655 is unique as an uncompromising DSP-based HD radio and FM receiver combined with a powerful 3-band audio processor and dynamic RDS encoder. IP connectivity adds streaming capabilities, and a web browser interface gives you total remote control of the unit from any PC or mobile device. The Aaron 655 gives you maximum flexibility for program sources. Select program audio from analog FM, digital channels HD1 through 8, streaming sources, and analog or AES digital line inputs, all with assignable failover audio backup. The internal RDS encoder allows you to customize your RDS messaging. You can use incoming off-air RDS data, convert HD radio pad data to RDS, convert streamed metadata to RDS, or receive IP telnet data. Comprehensive audio processing includes gated and windowed AGC, a unique syllabic leveler, 3 bands of compression, and both wideband and independent HF limiting. Easy setup is achieved by using 10 factory presets and 10 customizable presets. The processor also supports day parting, allowing automatic preset changes to follow different programming formats throughout your broadcast day. The front panel has an OLED display and jog wheel with intuitive menus for easy setup, advanced control, and editing for all operating parameters. The Aaron 655 dynamic web interface gives you total remote control of the unit from any PC or mobile device. A comprehensive set of menus includes a quick overview of now playing info, input-output control, processor options, RDS encoder, alarms and notifications, SNMP settings, and much more. You can also listen to the live audio broadcast streamed through the web interface.
It's really an awesome box. And in fact, Innovonics has it set up such that you can demo this box online at their website. So check that out. And if you want to pick one up or get a pricing or a quote or any of the other items from Innovonics, go to bgs.cc or call Broadcasters General Store at 352-622-7700. They are just awesome people, and I recommend them wholeheartedly at Broadcasters General Store. Thanks a lot for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. So we're talking with Ernesto Aguilar about community broadcasters. He's the program director at the National Federation for Community Broadcasters. And we were just getting ready to talk about licensing and relicensing and license renewal and these kind of issues that, commercial broadcasters have plenty of, maybe sometimes difficulty with in getting forms filled out, making sure they're filled out right. And I would think for a community organization built largely on volunteers, Ernesto, how does this kind of FCC paperwork get done with a community broadcaster?
It is very difficult for a lot of community broadcasters to get these things done as well, because oftentimes they end up doing these things on their own. Some organizations may have a law firm or an attorney that can look over things, but our organization has helped many stations navigate the filing issues that they run into. There are particular areas where stations that are non-commercial in nature need to disclose a few different things, such as boards of directors and such, for these stations, many of which have quite a few volunteers. As you can expect, their boards are oftentimes volunteers too. So there is a bit of turnover at times. And so trying to appropriately track those kinds of things turns out to be an ongoing issue as well. There are licensing requirements for things like streaming, which we can get into and such. But many of these stations just handle these things one by one and sometimes do it pretty well. And 9 times out of 10, I'd like to say do it pretty well. There are a few that run into issues, and depending on the station, because of the volunteer issue or a very minimal staffing issue, there can be turnover for managers or program directors or engineers or operations staff. So sometimes people are learning to ride the bike as they're filling these things out.
And as you've alluded to, there's turnover. So whoever did the license renewal, 7 years ago, may not be there anymore. So that there's a little extra handholding there, certainly. Oh, you mentioned streaming
for sure.
You mentioned streaming, and hey, we didn't have streaming back in 1978 when NFCB started, or in the 1980s or 90s when I was doing some volunteer work at WEVL. I got to believe that streaming is pretty important to community broadcasters, and maybe streaming is what they have instead of a license. Am I guessing right?
Streaming is incredibly vital for so many community broadcasters for a few different reasons. One, there's a big demand from audiences for streaming. Audiences really want to hear those stations, but also it's an opportunity for stations to connect in with different folks who may have moved away from communities. So the places we grew up, there's a good chance we've moved away from there. But I think all of us craves a sense of home. And so people will tune back into those stations and will decide that they'd like to support them. And stations understand that that's a revenue opportunity for them as well, just because people do move around for work and such. Stations are a great avenue for people who are new to a community. Maybe they're single, maybe they're looking for new friends, new experiences. And so stations try to make that stream available as a means to build a new relationship with a donor and to provide them a chance to get to know a community that station may have been a part of for decades, and as a result has a great deal of credibility. And so streaming for those stations can be so vital for their sustainability over the next few years. And when you're thinking about low power FM, many of those stations of which can only broadcast a mile or two, if that, streaming is a way for them to make a connection with a new listener who just isn't in that block or mile or 2 mile radius. Even those folks in that same city can't normally get access to that station unless you live in an extremely flat area. You're just not going to get a chance to hear that station. So streaming is the way to build a relationship with a listener, and for non-commercial broadcasters, the donors that you will depend on come pledge drive time.
Oh yeah, so you might very well have a donor of means who likes your station, but indeed, if you're an LPFM, that donor may very well live outside the coverage area, but streaming can cover that donor, obviously.
Well, into the conversation we had a few minutes ago about $10, stations understand that every one of those dollars really does count. The trends for non-commercial radio and for nonprofit giving as a whole, as gifts are shrinking down, people are feeling like it's better to spread out the wealth, so to speak, and to give $10 is a valuable thing. And we as an organization try to orient low power, full power stations to think about that $10 not as $10, but think about it as a relationship. So that person who gives $10 may be the next person who gives 500, may give 1,000. I mean, there's the old story of the Crocs, Ray Kroc, many of people have heard of through the fast food chain. his wife gave a significant donation to National Public Radio many years ago. But the story behind that is kind of ironic because she was asked later, well, why did you give this millions of dollars to NPR? And she is quoted as saying, because PBS didn't return my calls. So sometimes those individuals who you would think would not necessarily ever think about giving to you, sometimes that stream that you provide to them may be the $10 that they provide. Maybe in a few years down the line could be that person that gives you a big endowment. Stranger things have happened. And we try to encourage every station to think big. And to what Chris pointed out earlier, to think about how you sound. Think about what you invest in your radio station, what you invest in your engineering, what you invest in your equipment, because that is people's first experience with you. You can have the most beautiful content in the world, but without equipment, without an engineer who's attentive, without an aesthetic to what you do, the listener has so many choices right now that your stream, your broadcast terrestrial signal, how you present yourself online, those little details matter a great deal over years of time, because people don't normally give that $10,000 initially. They're going to be listening for a while, and what you give to that relationship, as well as what you give to any relationship, that contributions that you give into that relationship and the attention you give to that relationship, it matters to everyone.
So speaking of something that matters, and I want to ask you, Ernesto, how podcasting relates into community broadcasters. We're going to do that in a minute. Chris, I asked you earlier about studios, and I know that plenty of community broadcasters, they get a space given to them, or the rent is really cheap, and it's not ideal for a radio station. So what would you do physically to a space to help make it sound better? And maybe think about the HVAC system, because if you go into a house and you put a bunch of equipment in what used to be the parlor or the dining room or a bedroom, there's a good chance that the HVAC system is not going to be up to snuff to handle the heat load of your gear. What are some of your suggestions and ideas about that, Chris?
Oh, well, that's a hard question because, I've helped some podcasters do some studio stuff in their homes, in the spare basement or a spare room they have in the house. The hardest part is the physical size of the room. So without knowing the size, so say it's a typical, maybe you have a spare bedroom, a 10 by 10 or something a little larger. It's very tight quarters, but you can make it work. And the first thing to do is position yourself in the room so that when you open the door, you're walking into your space, your broadcast space. And here's why. If you walk into the room and alongside you on the right or left, depending on how the room and door is configured, is your console cabinet, your furniture, your stack of turntables or CD players that you're using. You now have created an obstacle course, and that's going to be a mess when things start to go crazy. You become popular and you start really growing and developing. All of a sudden now the workflow changes and you got people knocking over equipment because it's at the doorway. I've seen this done. I say this because I've seen this done. Because if people think it looks cool, you open the door and you're looking at somebody coming in. That doesn't work. Have it so that you walk into the space and you walk toward the workspace. So if your back is to the door, so be it. Until you become really, popular and famous where you can dictate the space you want to use, this is the approach you should consider. And the reason again is the workflow. So you have it, you walk into the room. Maybe it's the far corner, the far corner from the door. It works perfect. Why? Door opens, you have an open space to work with. People can still do their CDs or turntables or reel-to-reels, whatever you got in an L shape or V shape in the room across the side. Now you say you want to bring in some guests. Say you want to do guests. You want to do talking to community leaders or just community people, your neighbors, whatever. They want to come in. You know what? You open that door. To the right of the door could be a chair and a microphone on a mic stand. You can turn yourself around with a mic boom, depending how you design it, and now you can have a conversation. But what happened here is you haven't interfered with your workflow. You've introduced a new element, but it's an adjunct to what you're doing, not a disruption. It's not, let's move the CD players to the left so Jack can sit in front of me and now look at me and talk with the table stand microphone, which he can hear tapping his hand on the table because it's next to his hand. It distracts from what you're doing.
Yeah.
But if microphone is on a mic stand at a chair that you can move around, that space that you've created that's open, you now control the environment. See, as long as you stay in control of your environment for the studio, you can produce some of the best material regardless of the size of the room. I mean, you've seen me on location in places like a sports bar in a small booth where you can sit 4 people, and I've had had it work just fine, and you can hear me clearly. But the trick is, you look at your environment, look at what you're doing. So now you have a room where you may have to put an air conditioner in a window. Put the air conditioner in the farthest window you can, if possible. Second, if you have to, what you can consider, and it's very cheap actually, you can get a piece of sheetrock, a piece of plywood, and you can flag it, as it's used. The term is used in video and photography. Take a 4x8 sheet of wood, put it on the left or right side of the air conditioner that's facing your studio, your microphone, and block the airflow noise from the microphone. The room still gets cooled. Make sure the door is closed. Because remember, cold air goes to the bottom. Cold air goes out the door. Hot air comes in. You'll just do nothing for yourself. So make sure the door stays closed. Consider that as an approach. Maybe have it so that the equipment is on the same side of where you may be putting the air conditioner, so the cold air comes out, pushes the hot air away, and helps to circulate back in. There's a few ways to approach it. Also, the microphone you use. Get used microphones. They don't have to be brand new. Consider a shotgun microphone approach, and here's why. Shotgun microphone, yes, it's people like, it's overkill. No, it's not. It's a shotgun mic. Why? It's directional. It's pencil thin, so to speak. So think of it. Take the microphone, point it to where you're going to be talking, and look behind the mic, in the direction of where you speak into it. What's behind you? Is there anything behind you that could be picked up? No? Okay, great. If there is, turn a little bit, position yourself so it's focused on your mouth. What does that do? That reduces the room noise pickup. Like the microphone I'm using right now is the omnidirectional microphone. I guarantee you could hear my dog running around if I chose to make him bark and do stuff. But if I had a shotgun mic, I'm using my hand on the video, pointing at my handheld microphone right now, at a 45-degree angle down toward my mouth, which is the main source of audio, I minimize the room pickup and keep it focused on me. And I can stay close in, still sound great, and keep all the most ambient noise around me out. And that's the way to approach a small space that you don't control or may be inherited. These are things to consider. That's why I was talking about earlier. The studios I've built, and I've built studios for people. I'm talking name talent on broadcast networks. We're talking Fox, ABC, CBS, Westwood One, and a few others. I've built studios in their homes. And you'd think, this guy's making millions of dollars. He's a great show. He's got 600 affiliates. Why not? Let's do it at his house. Because the programming folks thought it was a great idea. Well, it's a great idea on paper. Boy, when I got to the house, it was a whole other story. Because why? It's their house. They don't want it, does your wife want the gear that you have in the living room? No. Does she want it in the bedroom or near the bedroom? No. So guess what? You're relegated to a closet or something similar to a closet, either in the basement or in the attic. And those are the facilities I've had to build for top name people. And you're like, okay, this is going to work interestingly. So it can be done. But you have to think about it. Try not to look at the cookie cutter approach. Don't think of it as a big studio. Just look at what you're trying to accomplish. If you're one person, single microphone on air, console, yes. And then say, well, we're going to have guests. How many guests? Well, we have 2. Are you sure it's going to be 2? Or is it just going to be 1 on a regular basis? Maybe 2 on a big to-do. So if it's 2 people once in a while, third input on the mixer, make the mic cable long enough to fit anywhere in the room, just pull it around, and then roll it up and tuck it away for now. Just leave the one microphone and mic stand out. No one says the microphone stand has to be tied down, screwed to the countertop. You could use a tabletop mic. You can use a stand, that stands up and reaches over. The boom mic reaches over the furniture. That gives you a flexibility to move it around. Now I've just made a small closet, a 2-person interview room. It can work. And now the other thing is, then people go, well, what about soundproofing? Let's make sure we understand this concept. This is true for both community, nonprofit, public radio, and commercial. Soundproofing has 2 approaches. One, what sound gets bounced inside the room, in the 4 walls of the room, is sound treatment. Soundproofing is the construction of those walls in conjunction with the ceiling and the floor to prevent the transmission of sound passing through.
Yeah.
In most home studios, we'll call it that, you're not going to be doing any real soundproofing unless you're going to start tearing up or caulking the floor or building a box within a box studio. Floating studios for those of you who really want to have some fun. So you have to think about the sound treatment approach and how do we reduce the amount of reflections in the sound of the room. The problem you're going to run into in the home is odds are you have a single pane window. It's not going to be very sound deadening. So you may have to consider a heavy blanket approach where you can put it on a little string and roll it up during the day, get sunlight when you want it, or roll it down during the broadcast and just muffle the sound that way. Takes us back to the type of microphones you use. If you're using a very directional microphone and practice using it, you've just reduced most of that ambient noise probably by 40 or 50%. There's several approaches you need to take. I mean, it's not easy. So to what Ernesto was talking about with engineering support or help for community stations, and how do you find people, and maybe, you can't, they're not interested. I always look at it from this point. When I've had calls from people who've asked me to consult them, and they've offered many things. Sometimes, usually it's a currency, there's money exchange. Many other times they say, look, we don't have this, we're starting out, we're doing this, but we do have a restaurant that is going to offer us a dinner for two for whomever we send over, because they're helping us build the station. Consider that approach. It's a move it forward, push it forward type of thing. I've done that on many occasions, and it comes back. Sometimes nothing happens, so be it. And other times I've actually gotten calls back from people I've helped and go, remember us last year? You did this, and this. Oh yeah, how's it going? It's going really well. We just signed a lease for a new studio space. Oh, you guys were doing it in the basement of someone's house. Yeah, it worked out. So it can happen. But you got to be willing to accept that it's a community facility. This is what it is, and it's not going to be always the best thing coming forward. Maybe not, but you put your best foot forward. You've offered something up, and I've worked with folks that have home studios a lot for the last 10 years, and I can say that about 3 or 4 of them have called me back and said, "Guess what? We're moving into a retail space that we're actually going to use." I'm like, "Hey, cool!" And I get a call about once every 6 months. Can you help us design this? Sure. Send them a note. Here's the paperwork. There you go. Have fun. It can happen. But you got to think about it, from both sides. The person on the radio reaching the community, and the community person trying to reach the community, and how can you bring the two together? And it's not easy, but it can work.
And whether your advice works, Chris, thank you for being pretty thorough about this. Whether you are building up a broadcast studio or a studio to do streaming, which is kind of the same thing, or whether you're doing podcasting. And Ernesto, I want to. We don't have much time left, but I want to ask you about podcasting and how that is important to community broadcasters and becoming more so these days. What can you tell us about podcasting?
Podcasting is such an exciting development for a lot of community broadcasters. I'm going to keep my answer short, but I do want to remind folks, please go back and rewind Chris's comments, because that is just golden. You've gotten a bunch of free consultation right there. But there are so many stations right now that have decided to delve into podcasting as a means of giving an introduction to their communities. There are stations like WTIP in rural Minnesota, which does one on outdoors and camping. There's WXPR, which is a podcast called We Live Up Here, which talks about its community, and many other stations that have decided, rather than try to compete with the big boys of the podcasting world, they're going to try to go small and try to focus in on telling stories in their communities and sharing music and culture and arts and youth in these areas as a means of creating a deeper connection with each other. Because while we focus on the digital, it's really about the story, and it's really about touching lives and communities.
You sent me a link to an amazing publication, the NFCB's Community Radio Podcasting Guide. Great title, should tell me all. What can a person expect to find out in this guide?
Well, we have decided to focus in for stations that may be trying to get their hands around exactly what podcasting is, to try to talk a little bit about how to talk to stakeholders about podcasting, how to understand the technology, how to monetize a podcast, how to structure it, and then how to put forward an actual podcast and how to staff it, and how to think about longevity. What you all are doing a few hundred episodes in is very unusual. Most podcasts don't get out of the 20th episode. I think the statistic is well over 60% don't get over past the 20th episode. So you're doing something very remarkable, and we'd like to encourage more stations to be able to do it, but a lot of them just need guidance. And so our guide is an attempt to help them get a head start on podcasting in the best way possible.
How I'd like to put a link for this in the show notes. Is this free? Do you have to be a member? How do you get this guide?
You can just go to our website and we'll get you a copy of it.
Okay. Awesome. Hey, tell you what, we're going to take one more quick break, and I'm doing the break, and we'll try to have a tip here. Ernesto, of course, you're the guest, so I forgot to I forgot to ask you about a tip, but if you, while I'm doing the ad here, if you can think of a tip you'd like for our listeners to be left with, what resource might you point people to, or what tip might you have for people who are either community broadcasters or they'd like to help somebody out who's a community broadcaster? Give us a tip like that. This Week in Radio Tech, I got to remind you, is brought to you in part by my friends at Angry Audio. And I know I already talked to you about them, but man, they're making these Studio Hub adapters that are so useful that I have used hundreds of these things in building radio studios at my stations and at others as well. And I just want to remind you, if you get these adapters right here, these adapter cables that are either XLR male or female or 1/4-inch tip ring sleeve, unbalanced RCA connectors, or even just bare wires, you get this kind of original looking Studio Hub. Just ask your dealer for a free cable. You get a free 7-foot Studio Hub cable. It's a shielded cable. It's pre-wired. It's got well put on RJ45 connectors. You should never ever have trouble with it. And if I hold it up correctly, you can even see the wiring color code on there. That's from your friends at angryaudio.com. They want you to know that even though the Radio Systems company closed their doors, the Studio Hub brand lives on, and angryaudio.com can take care of you as far as getting you parts for some of the existing consoles and existing systems. They can also get you lots of new things like these adapter cables and various adapters. Go to the website, angryaudio.com. We really appreciate their support. Thanks a lot. All right. You've been watching or listening to This Week in Radio Tech, and now's the time when we try to get a tip out of our host and guest. So, Ernesto, what can you leave our listeners with?
My tip is to encourage everyone who enjoys this fabulous program to search community radio in your local community, because especially if you are an engineer, one of the things that I have discovered is that there are a lot of young people that are looking for careers. Sometimes they get out of college and can't really find a direction. And many of them are technically minded and are curious and may have never even considered engineering, radio engineering in particular, as a career choice. And sometimes they need people with a bit of experience, and they get a chance to get some hands-on experience at a community radio station. So if you are technically minded or you've got a lot of radio experience, if you could volunteer a couple of hours anytime during a week or a month at a station, you might make a huge impact on a young person's life and help them find a career that they might have never even known about, but will impact them for the rest of their lives.
Great advice. And if people want to find out about your organization, is it nfcb.org?
Yep, sure is.
Okay. Cool. We'll have show notes in there. Chris Tobin, you got a tip of the week for us? Oh, is Chris frozen? Oh, no, he's frozen. Well, Chris has a tip every week, so we'll get one next week. Okay. All right. Hey, Ernesto, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day, both to prep me for the show and tell me all kinds of good things about what your organization is doing, and reminding me about what community broadcasters do, and honestly, how much fun. This is kind of like what radio used to be in the commercial world. So there's some fun and excitement left there with the excitement that we see in volunteers doing radio shows. So thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks so much, Kirk, for having me on, and thank you, Chris, as well. Great time.
Then we'll try Chris one more time. Did Chris make it back, or is he still frozen? I guess he's still frozen. Right. Hey, we got to go. Next week, I think we're going to be coming to you, live from the National Religious Broadcasters here in Nashville. We're going to try to coordinate with one of the, with Broadcaster General Store, and see if we can't broadcast live from their booth at the NRB convention right here in Nashville, Tennessee. We might be able to work it out. If we can't, well, we'll have fun anyway. Hey, tell your friends about This Week in Radio Tech, and please visit our sponsors at their websites, and hey, do business with them. It really helps us all. I want to say thanks to Suncast, our producer for the show, and thanks also to Andrew Zarian, who makes this possible by providing and being the founder of the GFQ Network, where you find other great podcasts. All right, we got to go. We'll see you next week on This Week in Radio Tech. Bye-bye.